your conference.
Okay.
There we go.
And as we start, I'd like to ask everybody, first of all, to put your telephones on mute if you have the ability to mute your phone so that we don't pick up background noise or chit-chat. Feel free to unmute your phone if you need to ask a question. I think this is a small enough group that we can take questions as we go. Simply speak up if you have a question about something. I will be talking through the agenda so you have a sense of whether the topics you're interested in are going to be covered. Just to introduce myself, my name is Valerie Matthews. I'm the Federal Sales Engineer for Dragon in Healthcare for Nuance, which is the vendor of Dragon, naturally speaking. Nuance is, we like to say, it's the biggest software company you've never heard of because it, in addition to Dragon Medical and its sister product, Dragon Naturally Speaking, which is the retail version, we have a number of other speech technologies. Anytime you call up a system like your bank or an airline and talk to a machine or have a machine talk back to you or talk to your cell phone or your car, that probably has Nuance technology in it. And we also have imaging software such as the product OmniPage and OmniForm that you may be familiar with, PDF converter. So there was a Dragon Systems company many years ago. It's gone through several acquisitions and has become part of what is now known as Nuance. I've been involved in the rollout of maps to the Army. I've been, both Robin and myself, I'll briefly introduce Robin Rains, or actually, Robin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Robin Rains. I'm the product specialist for Dragon Medical, and Val and I have been working with the MAPS trainers and Arlene and going to the sites, and we're really excited about this rollout.
And so, based on some of our experience and some of our dealing with IMD folks at various sites, both we and Arlene came up with the notion that we should do a little presentation targeted at IMD folks. There are still some open questions about how Dragon is to be supported, but there are some basic administrative skills and tasks that it pays to go over. So, in anticipation, or rather, in the absence of any formal training for Dragon administrators, we agreed to put together this 2-hour webinar. The topics that we'll be going over, I'll give you a quick demo of Dragon Medical for those of you that haven't seen it, and if you don't spend time watching providers do their work, then you might not have actually seen Dragon. We're not going to make that assumption. And after you've seen a demo, just to get an idea of what it is the provider does with it, we'll talk about the topic that usually takes the most discussion, which is setting up roaming user files on the network. Whether you're actually going to be doing this right away is one of those open questions I mentioned. Some of the Army facilities that have already implemented Dragon in the past have chosen to set up roaming user files. The Army as a whole, as part of the MAPS rollout, is not promoting the use of roaming user files right away, given the large number of providers that the Army needs to support and the fact that you might not have planned for enough disk space to hold these files on the network or enough people to manage the server where they reside. Kind of the quickest way to get going will be to place the roaming user files on the local PC. But some of your sites either have implemented roaming in previous versions of Dragon, or you may be well on the way toward planning a roaming implementation for version 10. So we will talk about the mechanics of how that works, as well as some of the planning that you need to do if you're thinking about it. When you set up roaming user files, the recommended setup is to put them all in a shared directory on the network, and then it's nice on each user's machine to set up a shortcut that will open the user file directly. So that's a small topic there on creating a shortcut. Upgrading version 9 user files. So if you have users of version 9 or earlier versions of Dragon, in some cases users can upgrade their own files. In particular, if you have roaming users already, then an IT person, an administrator, has to upgrade those files for the end users. So we'll talk about both cases and what the process looks like in each case. We'll talk about a very nice feature in Dragon that I think is going to be increasingly important with maps, which is data distribution, the ability to take custom sets of words and commands and distribute them in an automated fashion to multiple users so that they don't all have to recreate the wheel. Dragon is highly customizable, and it's nice for providers to have an easy way of sharing customizations with each other. So that's what the data distribution tool will do. And then a few other settings that the administrator can make in the Dragon installation. We're not going to be covering installing Dragon from scratch from the DVD because the norm is going to be to install it from an SMS package. Certainly you will be if you're not installing it that way already. But we will talk about what settings you can make as part of the installation that you may want to decide on a site-specific basis. A nice thing that you can do for end users after installing Dragon on any given PC is to perform an audio check. It's not so obvious how to do this without taking the extra time of launching Dragon and creating a new user file. So we'll show you the shortcut for doing that. Setting default options, as I mentioned a minute ago, there are some site-specific defaults that you might want to set, and we'll talk about how you set those. Running the Acoustic and Language Model Optimizer. This is a tool that periodically retrains Dragon based on dictation that each user has already done. And if you have roaming user files, then running the optimizer becomes an administrative task. So you'll have to know how to do that in the event that you're setting up roaming. So we'll spend a few minutes on that. Another task that is not strictly administrative, but administrators often get called on to help out with, is how to save the Dragon user file so that an end user can take it with them if they move to another facility, for example, or if they want to use Dragon at home, which would be permitted. We'll talk about how to do that. And then finally, to support ongoing troubleshooting of Dragon, we want to make sure you can find the Dragon error log file, and also if you have an idea of where all the files are that Dragon puts on the hard drive, that can help in a troubleshooting situation. So that'll be the last thing we talk about. After this webinar, additional resources that you're going to have at your fingertips are as follows. Everything I'm going to be talking about this evening, with a few exceptions, is covered in the Dragon Medical Installation and Administration Guide. And we verified, even though we at Nuance don't have access to the MAPS portal, we verified that this document is out there on the MAPS portal. And there's the URL to the Usability website if you're not familiar with that. And the MAPS portal is listed over on the right-hand side of that web page. So make sure you've got that one bookmarked. And then the other one you'll want to bookmark is isupport.nuance.com. We're recommending that each MTF have at least 2 people designated support contacts for Dragon. There's a memo that has gone around with instructions for how each of you can sign up for support with Nuance under the MedCom contract. And the URL, once you've signed up, is there. Also, if you haven't formally signed up for support, you can get onto this site as a guest and view the knowledge base, which has lots of good information in it. And then finally, the online help for the product. Any PC where you have Dragon Medical installed, you can launch Dragon and run the help from there. And there is a section on resolving problems, mainly geared towards the kinds of things that end users run into, especially as they're trying to improve the accuracy of the product. But it's useful to know that there's a great deal of information in the help. There is, like with many software products, we print very little documentation because we know end users don't read it. But we put all the end user information and some administrator information in the online help, and then this administrator guide will be your best reference. So that's what we'll be covering this evening, and resources that will be available to you after this webinar. And then what I'd like to do is go ahead and share my screen and give you a quick demonstration of what it looks like to run Dragon Medical. And as you can see, I've got Alta running here. I'm also not going to assume that if you're in an IT function that you're all that familiar with Alta. But basically, when a provider is documenting encounters with patients, they spend most of their time either, let me add an additional note, they'll spend most of their time either on a screen like this, where they have a free text area in which they can enter any text. You can see at the top of my screen that I have the Dragon toolbar, which indicates the Dragon is running. I have an indicator that the microphone is currently off. I could either click it or just use a keystroke to turn it on. It's quicker to use the keystroke, so that's what I'll do. Captain Williams comes in today for evaluation of his headaches period. He states that over the last 2 to 3 years he has had intermittent headaches, and over the last 2 to 3 months these have increased in frequency to about once per week. The headache lasts 24 to 36 hours in each case period. So you speak, Dragon transcribes just about as fast as you can talk. And if it makes a mistake, as it made the reasonable mistake when I said Captain Williams, it put Kevin Williams. I can easily fix that mistake by voice as well. Select Kevin. Spell that. And then I can either spell or type Captain the way I want it to be spelled. Note that it gives me some options here. And when I click OK, that trains Dragon to be less likely to make the same mistake again, and it also fixes my text in my document. Okay. So providers will typically use Dragon either there or in the Add Note field, which accommodates a larger amount of text. And the one additional end-user capability I'll show you is the ability for users to build their own commands. And generally that's just a short couple of words that will enter a large block of text like this. ROS headache. So I just say ROS headache, and it puts in a typical review of systems for a headache, and then I could select either manually or by voice any of this text and change it. So I don't want to go into a lot of detail on what the end user does with Dragon, but did want to give you a quick demo for those of you that haven't seen it. And of course, most of the effort in the MAPS training project is training the trainers, the Alta trainers, on how to get users to this point where they're getting this kind of accuracy and where they know how to build their own commands and so forth. Let me just cancel out of this. And go back to the slides for a minute. So what has to happen kind of behind the scenes for all of this to work is that each user in Dragon has to have what's called a user file. This is a pretty sizable amount of data. The basic user file is anywhere from about 20 to 30 megabytes. Something like 25 megabytes is typical. And this file contains a model of the user's voice, which the user generates by training the system when they first launch Dragon. It will prompt them to enter a username, and it will create a file for them. They read to it for about 5 minutes, so it gathers a lot of acoustic information about the user's voice. The user also tells it which medical specialty they belong to, and it sets up a vocabulary for that user. And then over time, that file takes on additional customization, such as custom commands that the user can build and words that the user can add to the vocabulary. So the user file is a good-sized file. By default, Dragon will put it on the local hard drive. But optionally, and this is a very popular feature with physicians, you can create what's called roaming user files in Dragon. And as the note says at the bottom, this is unrelated to Microsoft Windows roaming. You don't have to be using Windows roaming profiles in order to use roaming with Dragon. It's just that we happen to use the same name because in principle it's the same kind of capability. It's information that follows you as you move from PC to PC. So this capability is not so critical in MAPS implementations where providers are being assigned individual tablet PCs and the provider takes the tablet everywhere they go. In that case, it makes perfect sense to keep the user file right there on the tablet, but it will also make a great deal of sense to set a backup location so that Dragon will automatically back it up to the network once in a while without the provider having to do anything. That's unrelated to roaming and is something we'll talk about later. Roaming users are most useful in cases where the user has multiple machines accessible to them. For example, in primary care, a physician often has a machine in his or her office, and then in each exam room there might be 2 or 3 additional PCs that they use. And in that case, rather than go through the effort of training Dragon on each machine or making a user file and manually copying it around, that's where the roaming capability becomes extremely useful. The roaming feature is designed to minimize network traffic. What it does is it caches a local copy of the user file on each PC where that user file has been used. It copies what we call the master file down from the network onto the PC. And then once that's been done, anytime the user makes changes, at the end of the Dragon session, it will take those incremental changes and save them back up to the master copy on the network. If the user then goes to a different machine where they've used Dragon before, it doesn't download the whole file. Again, it just downloads the incremental changes. And another nice benefit of having that local cache copy on the PC is that you can take the PC off the network entirely. So if your wireless connection goes down, or if you want to take the PC to another location, like if you're doing physical exams at a school, then you can still use Dragon with the local copy of the user file. And then the changes will get resynchronized the next time you have a Dragon session when you're connected to the network. So that's what the roaming user capability is designed to do, and it's designed to be as transparent as possible to the end user. The end user is typically not necessarily aware of whether they're using a roaming user file or not. So when you decide where to place these on the network, we recommend placing all the user files in one shared directory. The reason for this is that there are some administrative tasks that you need to do, the big ones being upgrading the user files as you go from one major release of Dragon to the next. User files don't need to be upgraded in general when we come out with a point release, but we come out with a major release of Dragon every couple of years, and the user file format generally changes enough that the files have to be upgraded. So upgrading roaming user files is an administrative task, and it's a lot easier to do than if the files are all collected in one directory. The other task is the acoustic and language model optimizer that I mentioned a few minutes ago and that we'll talk about later. Again, it's easier to optimize a whole bunch of user files if they're stored in one place. Something that might be perceived as a minor drawback for the user, and they have to be properly educated in this situation, is that when you launch Dragon, it will show you a complete list of all the users on the system, and users have to be trained to choose their own name. You can do that simply by typing the first couple of letters of your name, and it will go right there. That's just something users have to be trained to do. These files can be protected and probably should be protected using Windows Active Directory permission, which means that even though you can see the list of all the users on the system, you can't open another user's file because Windows should give you a message saying it's protected against you. Oh, I just realized I wasn't sharing my screen. Let me switch back to my screen and show you again what the end user sees. If you set up roaming users, the end user will see a list of all the users that are in that shared directory, but as long as you just type the first few letters to uniquely identify the user, Dragon will select that user immediately. If you're going to go ahead and set this up, then what you need to do is, if you're going to set this up manually, you need to change this in the administrative settings of Dragon. And this is an option that's not available to end users. In fact, if you're not logged into the PC as an administrator, you're not going to see that administrative settings menu item at all. It's just not going to be there. The fact that I have this menu item and it's grayed out means that I can't make the settings because I have a user file open. I had it open, I was using it to dictate. So let me go and close it, which I can do from the Dragon menu here. So anytime you're changing or even just looking at the administrative settings in Dragon, you'll have to develop this reflex of closing the user file if it's currently open. Should be closed. You know what? I think I accidentally hit Save User Files instead of Close User. Okay, now I've got the message saying no user files are loaded. I can't do much else in Dragon, but I can get into the administrative settings. So the way this works is that by default, roaming users are not enabled. In other words, Dragon will create the user file in a default location on the local PC. We'll take a look at where that is later. If I go ahead and check this enable box, then you won't ordinarily see an entry here. I've got one in here because I set it up yesterday. Let me just go ahead. Ordinarily, this would be empty, and you would click the Add button. If I just take this existing one and click the Edit button, we'll see the same exact screen. There are two pieces of information you need to provide here. One is called the display name. In other words, this is what the end user will see on that Open Users window as the location of the user file. Ordinarily, you're going to put in something generic like roaming users or Dragon users. But if you have your user files distributed across multiple directories, which you might want to do, if you have several hundred users, then it might make your life a little bit easier, as well as the end user's life a little bit easier, if you divide them up, say, by clinic or by department, just so that you don't have all 200 or 500 users sitting in one directory. That's perfectly okay to do. So you could have multiple roaming user network locations showing up on the list here. And then you have to provide the network location. And as you can see from the examples here, you can use a mapped network drive, or you can use a UNC path, or you could even use a web server, but there's probably not much reason for doing that because you've already got Windows file protection on these user files. By virtue of the fact that users have to log in with their own Windows user ID. So you can either enter the full path. What I've done here is I've faked this out by using an address on my C drive. Normally this would be a network drive, W or something like that. But if you want to experiment with this on your own and you don't have a network location that you can logically use for it, you can just create a folder on your local hard drive and pretend it's a network directory, and Dragon won't know the difference. Everything will look just the same. But you can either type in the full path or browse to it using this browse window here. When I click OK, now I'll see this setting in the list here. And I'll just set up that one location for now. The local directory, which is where it caches the local copies of those roaming user files, I would recommend leaving it as the default. You're probably likelier to introduce problems by changing it rather than leaving it alone. And then of the various checkboxes you see here, there's only one that we would recommend changing from its default. The set audio levels on each machine. What happens every time you open Dragon on a machine where you haven't used it before, you get prompted to do what's called the audio setup. We'll take a look at it later on. But it asks you to read about 2 screens worth of information. It takes about 30 seconds. And it adjusts Dragon's volume level for the microphone, and it also does a quality check on your sound system. Some providers don't mind doing that every time they use Dragon. It gives them a way to kind of get their voice warmed up and guarantee that it's working as well as it can be. But most providers find it to be annoying if they have to run this every time they switch machines in Dragon. So even though it says recommended here, that means our engineers recommend it, trainers typically recommend checking it off because Dragon does accommodate a certain amount of variation in the user's voice. And it really is kind of a burden to make the user run the audio setup every time. The other setting that you might be involved with is if you are in the process of converting a local user file to a roaming user, then you'll check this first setting temporarily to allow that local user file to be open just for the purpose of saving it into the roaming user directory. So you won't ordinarily leave that on. Okay. If you check this on, in fact, let me go ahead and make all those settings. And I'll show you where the settings that we made are visible to the end user. The window that they see when they launch Dragon, or that I can bring up manually by clicking Open User, contains not only a list of users, but a list of roaming user locations. So the display name that I just entered, roaming users, is what shows here for the location of user files. But I also have a lot of other locations that I can find on my hard drive, and I can also manually browse to any location that I choose. That gives the end user a lot of leeway to create user files anywhere and to get confused about where their user files are. So we don't recommend leaving that setting enabled for the long term. If I come here and turn it back off, and then go back into the Open User dialog. Okay, now I can see I have no choice about where to open my user file. If I click this New button, it'll get created in the roaming user directory, or if I select an existing one, it will open it from that roaming user directory. So we've done what is generally a good thing, which is to minimize the number of choices available to the end user. So I think that's a major advantage of using roaming, is that way you always know where the user files are. Any questions on this so far? Because I know we jumped right into this with both feet. Okay. These slides will be made available on the Maps portal as well if they haven't already. So I will mention that everything on all of this material will be available to you. So again, the summary for how to get into those administrative settings for Dragon was, first of all, be logged in as an administrator on the PC. Second of all, close the user file. Third, go to the administrative settings on the menu. Or as an alternative, there's a shortcut that will let you go straight to the administrative settings without having Dragon running. So if you're not actually using Dragon, you just want to make settings, entering this command line is the quickest way to do it. And a final note is that all of the settings that I'm showing you here, these administrative settings, can be configured as part of an installation package. What happens is you'll probably set this up, well, what you will have to do is set up roaming or the other administrative settings manually on one PC, and then Dragon will store those settings in INI files, which you then propagate to other machines by making them part of an installation package. I'm not going to go into detail on how that's done, but the installation administration guide that I mentioned earlier has instructions for how to do that. Okay. So we've just seen a little demonstration of how those are set up. And then one really nice thing that you can do once you've got that long list of users in that shared directory, and this applies for roaming as well as non-roaming user files. If you have several providers sharing a PC that has local user files on it, you've got the same situation. They've got a list and they have to choose. So whether the files are roaming or not, you can tell Dragon to open a specific user file by putting that username on the Dragon command line. And to show you how that looks, let me go back to my desktop. If I create a new shortcut, and specify the Dragon program files. Location is fairly straightforward. See program files, Nuance, Naturally Speaking 10, program, and then the name of the file is NatSpeak, for the old product name Naturally Speaking. And then what I do is I put on the end of the command line, I put /user, and then I have to put the full name of the user file, including any spaces, and I believe that's case sensitive as well. Once I've done that, I've got a shortcut that runs Dragon, or actually I call it this. Okay, so if you have multiple providers on a machine, you could create multiple shortcuts, one called Dr. Smith's Dragon and one called Dr. Robinson's Dragon, and so forth. So when I double-click that, it should go straight to my user and instead of coming up with that open user menu. Okay, so that I hope gives you an idea of the level of effort involved in setting up user files. One point that I didn't mention, and there is some material on this in the user guide, if you have not yet set up roaming, then one of your first questions as an IT person is going to be, how much disk space are these things going to take up? I mentioned that the basic user file, which contains all the data Dragon needs to do speech recognition, is about 25 megabytes. In addition, however, it saves an additional up to 500 megabytes worth of data, which is actual dictated text and the corresponding audio. That's why the files are so big. This data is used by the Acoustic and Language Model Optimizer whenever you run it to retrain the user file. And in the case of a roaming user, I'll show you where that value is set. So if I go back to the administrative settings, yeah, I neglected to mention down here at the bottom where it says disk space reserved for network archive. So the default is 500 megabytes. But if you want to move to a roaming user implementation and you don't have 500 megabytes worth of disk space per user, if you've only got, say, 100 or 200, then go ahead and set this value to something smaller. This value would have to be set on every PC on your network, as is true with all of these administrative settings. The settings that I'm making here apply only to the installation of Dragon on my local PC. The same settings would have to be made either manually or by putting the INI files as part of an installation package. So we do get this question once in a while: how much data should we be saving? 500 is obviously a very round and arbitrary number. All other things being equal, the more data, the better. But if you don't have space for that much data, then retain whatever you do have space for. Is the way I would answer that question. I want to spend the next few minutes talking about what to do if you've got user files from earlier versions. So actually, let me ask if there are any other questions at this point about roaming users. It's real quiet out there. Just remember to unmute your phone if you're trying to talk to us. All right. Based on our experience with some of the Army sites that we visited, upgrading existing user files can be a pretty smooth operation, or it can be something close to a nightmare. We found that if roaming, in particular, if roaming users have been implemented, or if the facility has made several false starts at implementing roaming users, we might find a mix of roaming and local users. We might find that roaming user files have been set up, but users are actually using individual local user files instead. So it's not always obvious. Once you've got Dragon installed and running for a while, it's not always obvious, certainly not obvious to the end user where the user file lives, and it may take a little detective work on the part of the administrator as well. One reason it's important to know whether they're local or roaming is not only do you need to know where they are, but if the user files are local, then Dragon will permit the end user to upgrade them. If the user files are roaming, then an administrator needs to upgrade them, and the reason for this is that you actually have to, typically the way you do this is you install Dragon on an administrator's PC, and instead of enabling roaming, you simply manually browse out to the roaming user directory. This is to force Dragon to upgrade the copy that's on the network as opposed to the locally cached copy, which doesn't do any good since it doesn't go to the network. Okay. So if you have an existing roaming user implementation, then hopefully all of your roaming user files are in a single directory, because then you can just set up a single session in which you upgrade all the user files, and I'll show you what that looks like. If you've got local user files, then it's probably more straightforward for each end user to upgrade his or her own user file, typically with the help of a trainer, since this is something that the end user is only going to have to do every couple of years. It's good for a trainer to be there to walk them through the process. Also, as a workaround to a bug that we've discovered in the upgrade procedure, this is something that we've communicated to Arlene, who should have communicated it to all the trainers, and we'll show you what that involves as well. If you are converting local user files to roaming and you're also upgrading them to version 10, it doesn't particularly matter whether you upgrade them first and then move them to roaming or vice versa. Just you probably want to define yourself a consistent procedure. I happen to think that it will be easier to upgrade them first and then convert them to roaming, but it probably depends a little bit on how your configuration is set up. Okay. So if you walk up to a machine that has Dragon on it, how do you, let me switch to my desktop again. I'll keep forgetting to do that. If you walk up to a machine that has Dragon on it, how do you figure out whether the user files are roaming or not? Probably your first clue is simply to launch Dragon, or if it's already running, just go into this Open User dialog. And if the location of user files doesn't give the user any options, okay, then it's a safe bet that the user file on the network, the roaming user file, is the one that's actively in use. If you see multiple options in here, or the other thing you could do is, again, go into the administrative settings and see what you've got set up in here. Okay. If this allow non-roaming users to be open checkbox is checked, okay, that can result in a confusing situation in which the user may be using either a local or a roaming user file. And what I think it pays to do there is to actually sit there with the end user and take a note of what their routine is. Ask them, what do you do when you start Dragon every day when you come into your office? And see if they, do they have to make a selection down here at the bottom. Take note of, if they don't change the selection at the bottom here, at least take note of what it is. Let me enable that setting so you can see what it looks like again if they've got that setting enabled to allow non-roaming users to be opened. Okay, so if they simply choose a user from the list, make sure you take note of which user location is selected at the time they do that, because that'll tell you where the user file is. If they launch Dragon and it automatically opens a user file, then you'll have to work a little harder to find out what it's doing, because that generally happens if you have local user files and there's only one user file on the system, because in that situation Dragon will open the local user file automatically. If you want to verify that, which you probably do, then you want to go into Dragon, Open User, okay, and then if you simply see default here and no other choices, and just a single user here, then that's probably what's happening. Although we have seen a strange situation in which Dragon was set up for roaming, and the only thing that appeared here was a roaming user directory, but it was still opening a local user. In fact, when we went into this Open User dialog, there actually were no roaming user files visible in the roaming user location. So that was kind of a special case that I hope we don't run into very often. But at least use a couple of those tricks to make sure you understand where the user file is. A local user file, a so-called local user file, could actually be in a network location, just that Dragon is opening it as if it were on a local drive, because, as I said, you can browse to any location and open a file from there. Just because a file is on the network doesn't mean Dragon is treating it as a roaming user.
This is Terrell in IMD.
Hi.
LAC. What are the extensions on the user files?
There are various extensions. I guess since the question is coming up, I'll go ahead and take a look at that user file. I'll show you what the user file directories look like. Under, if you want to browse these yourself on a machine that has Dragon, you'll want to go under C, Documents and Settings. The user files are kept under All Users, because Dragon has its own shared directory to put them in. And then Application Data, which is a hidden folder, so make sure that your Windows Explorer settings are set to show hidden folders for you to be able to see this. And then it's under Nuance, Naturally Speaking 10. And then if you have local user files, they're going to be in this directory called Users. Okay. I only have a single local user on this machine. So you'll see a directory which has the user name. The name of the directory should correspond exactly to what shows up in this open user dialog here if I switch to my default. Yeah, so it's a kind of complicated name because it's been upgraded, matches the directory name exactly. And then under that directory, you have a number of files. The ones that are actively used for dictation are in this current directory. As you can see, there are a number of subfolders under that. So there's some ini files with user-specific settings. There's a vocabulary file which has the vocabulary words and formatting information. So there's no single file extension. It's a directory tree with a fairly complex structure.
Thanks.
Can you go to that window where you had the
where we had the
and you had file roaming for a number of entries in there? Are they
Yeah.
separate files or are they just separate? How is that structured?
There are separate subdirectories within the tree. Yeah, this one user called val pretend roaming, that's the one I use most of the time. It's really only one user, but it has several different vocabularies. And this is more of an end-user topic, but a user can create multiple vocabularies within a single user file. So I've got general medical, I've got surgery, I've got one called general that I use for my email. And then I have 3 different microphones, mic in, USB, and power mic 2. So it looks like I have 9 different users there, but it's really all one tree. What that looks like, if I go to my pretend roaming directory here that I'm pretending is on the network and look at that and look under the current directory, you can see that I have a lot more subdirectories under current because those represent the different microphone acoustic models and the different vocabularies.
Got it.
And then since I'm pretending this is the network directory, that's got the whole shebang in it. If I go back to my local hard drive under Documents and Settings, let me make that big enough to see. Under my local hard drive under Documents and Settings, the directory called Roaming Users has the local cache copies of the roaming user files from the network. Okay. And then you're going to have a subdirectory that corresponds to the display name that you create when you set up the roaming user directory, and then under that you'll have the actual user file. And under that you'll have the current directory. So this is what the local cache copy looks like. It's got fewer entries in it because I have not used all of the vocabularies and all of the different microphones. Okay, I've only used a couple of them, so those are the only ones that got cached in this local cache.
So for a user who's logging in and has got to make a pick of himself, will he see multiple entries depending on all the vocabularies and to make a choice?
Exactly, yes. If a user has created multiple vocabularies, then they will always have to make a choice when they launch Dragon. Same thing if they're using multiple types of microphones. Once they've opened Dragon, and again this is more of an end-user topic, but they can rapidly switch between vocabularies. Actually, let me get that user open so you can see what this looks like. And this is something that we've talked about in the MAPS training, so the trainers should be familiar with this. If I'm an end user and I've opened my user file with a specific vocabulary, then I can switch vocabularies by going to this Open Recent Vocabulary list. So all 3 of them appear there, and I can just pick the vocabulary I want to use without completely reloading the user. That's a little bit quicker. Any other questions on the file structure we just looked at while we're here?
I'm sorry. I'm still a little confused on. You said that each roaming profile is 500 meg, right? 500
on top of that 25 megabytes. So allow 525 megabytes.
And as say that one computer can have like 10 different people work on it. So that's a pretty large directory.
Well, the per user allotment on the local hard drive is actually smaller because it will, for roaming users, the acoustic optimizer data gets accumulated for the current session, and then it does not get retained on the local machine once it's been copied up to the network. So this local cache is typically smaller than the master copy that's on the network. If you're using purely local user files, then again the amount of optimizer data that it saves is smaller since it's only got one machine to draw from. And I don't remember the total offhand. I think it's on the order of 200 megabytes rather than 500. I think the administrator guide has all of that detail in it. Yeah. So if you're using local user files, probably you don't have so many different people sharing a machine that they're going to run out of user file space. But it is, of course, a big concern if you're setting up roaming users. And it's something of a concern if you're setting up user files so that they get backed up to a network directory. And maybe since we're on the topic of file locations, we should probably talk about that next. Because if you've set up local user files, let's see, we still need to talk about the upgrade, so I will go back to that. But I don't have. Okay, I don't have a descriptive slide on how to do this, but let me go back to my screen and show you where that's set up. Because of course, the risk of storing any data on the local hard drive is that the user could drop their machine out the window, or the hard drive could have a irrecoverable failure. Files get lost, and that's why we back up files. To force Dragon to back up the user file to a network location, that's also an administrative setting. So let me close the user that I have open.
Presentation, how to set up this and that, but when they come here, they're going to give us a class.
Okay. Let me go over to the miscellaneous tab, and the first thing you have here is backup location for user files. Now, the default for that backup location is in a parallel directory. If we go back to that directory structure and look at the local user file, there's Dr. Hansen. Note that he has a current directory, and he's also got a backup directory. So I'm not sure that's going to contain anything. Yeah, because I haven't used this file enough to get it to be backed up. What happens is every 5 times the user saves their file, so basically every 5 Dragon sessions, so approximately once a week, Dragon will take a copy of this current directory and place it in this backup directory. So that's a safeguard against the user screwing up their file and needing to go back to a previous version. But it's not a safeguard against the entire hard drive going south and the user losing all of that information. So what we would recommend is taking this backup location for user files, which is an administrative setting, and changing it to a network location. And here it might be reasonable, instead of using a shared directory, to use a personal drive, such as the user's home drive. So if you have a drive letter that's mapped differently for each user, what's typically called a home drive, provided that has enough space, that couple of 100 megabytes or so, then that would be a perfectly okay place to put the user file. Because you're not going to upgrade it from there, you're not going to run the optimizer there, but you're just going to have that as safekeeping so that the user can recover it in case something goes wrong with their hard drive. So that's where you would change the backup location there. That is a per system setting. So whatever backup location you set here has to be applicable to every user that's going to use that PC. And specifically, if you're going to use that user's home drive, that means you need to use the drive letter and not the full path to a specific user's home drive.
Now,
yeah.
Just a quick question. If we're going to be doing this in a phased approach, but the bottom line is that we're going to go to an enterprise feeling in the end, shouldn't it be wise for everybody to plan for roaming profiles?
I would say everybody should certainly be thinking about roaming profiles. I know there's been some discussions among the MAPS project team, which we at Nuance don't participate in directly, but we got a message today saying that the initial guidance for the MAPS project is not to worry about roaming for now. I know there are exceptions. There are facilities that are actively either thinking about roaming or who already had roaming set up in version 9. And that's perfectly okay, but the guidance for the MAPS project says don't necessarily go to roaming right away.
an editorial from an IT perspective, then you'll be hit down the line with some of the issues that you said in terms of conversion, finding out where these things are and moving them to a roaming down the line.
Right.
So either you do it up front and easier, or you're worried about down the line and may have hit a bunch of problems. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is if you do go to roaming, then that's going to be a local facility decision. If you're kicking this around, it's probably a good idea to get one of us on the phone with you to bounce your thoughts off of us, especially if you're supporting a great number of users. I've been participating in several phone calls like that recently with the larger MTFs. So yeah, feel free to. Arlene knows how to get in touch with me. Probably what I can do is put my email address up at the end of this meeting if you want to pull me into that kind of discussion.
Thanks.
Okay.
Valerie, this is Chris Rector at Camp Zama. Just one quick question. There is a difference between a roaming network user profile and a locally based network file, right?
Exactly, because the roaming, let me get back to the slide that went over the characteristics of roaming user files.
With the roaming, not only are you looking at the storage aspect of it, but also the transfer aspect of it, network speed, where they're located, whether or not they're coming in on the VPN, and other issues.
Exactly, those things are all going to be issues. So if you set up Dragon for local user files, but users browse out to the network, to a network location to create that file, then every time you run Dragon, it has to pull down the whole 25 megabytes worth, and every time you close Dragon, it has to push the whole 25 megabytes or so back up to the network. So it uses more network bandwidth than the roaming implementation does. You've also got that aspect of the local cache, so the Dragon can still be used if the network is unavailable. So in other words, if you set up true roaming users, then all of these things are true. If you're simply browsing to a network location, okay, then none of those things is true. Okay, hopefully that clarified things for some of you, although it possibly raised more questions for others of you. But like I said, we can keep having this discussion as you make your decisions about how to set things up. Let's take a look at the upgrade procedure then. For those of you that do have user files from version 9 or earlier versions, Dragon will always upgrade up to 2 versions back. In other words, if you have user files from version 9 or even version 8, those can be directly upgraded in version 10 simply by the user opening the user files. If it's a local user, Dragon will prompt them through the upgrade. If you still have people using Dragon version 7 or earlier, then you would have to have an intermediate version to be able to upgrade them. In other words, you'd have to upgrade them to 8 or 9 before you could go to 10, or the user would simply have to recreate their user file starting from scratch with a new version 10 user file, which is not such a bad idea if they've been using Dragon for that long, because there are a lot of improvements that have been made. But if you do have version 9 user files, which is the most common situation because we did have a lot of individual Army facilities purchasing version 9, as well as a lot of individual users who managed to get it in there on their own. So identify your existing user files, and as I mentioned earlier, the local user files, after the user's machine is upgraded, Dragon should still be able to locate the old version user files. I will point out that if you're doing the upgrade manually rather than through SMS, at the end of the upgrade procedure, Dragon will prompt you, the administrator, to upgrade the user files. What we would probably recommend doing is not doing that step as part of the upgrade, simply decline that offer when Dragon makes it, but instead leave it up to the end user, again with the assistance of a trainer, to do the upgrade on their own user file. So when the end user runs Dragon, it will locate their old user file, and then when they open it, it will give them a message saying it needs to be upgraded, and it'll walk them through the upgrade wizard. We'll see what that looks like, because it's very similar for local and roaming users. The reason I would recommend having the end user do their own user file upgrade is because of permission issues we've run into. It's not that commonly, but at least a couple of sites where when the administrator upgraded the end user's file, the end user was not able to open it when they were logged in under their own user account. Okay, so you're less likely to run into file permission issues if you let the end user do the upgrade. With roaming user files, as I mentioned, you do have to be an administrator running Dragon on a machine where roaming has been disabled. And let me switch back to my desktop so we can see what that actually looks like. So I'll go into my administrative settings. I'm going to disable roaming, and then I'm going to, just for purposes of doing the upgrade, I'm going to browse to that roaming user network location. But since I don't have roaming enabled, Dragon is going to open and upgrade those user files as if they were local. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but that is the procedure. This is pretty completely laid out in that administrator guide. So that's one of the aspects that I think we documented pretty completely, is how to do the upgrade. So when you as an administrator are running the upgrade, probably what you'll do is you won't have Dragon running at all. You're going to go to your Start menu on a machine where Dragon has been installed. So you've installed Dragon on your own administrator workstation. You go to Dragon Medical 10, Dragon Medical Tools, Upgrade Users, and this runs a utility called the Upgrade User Wizard. And this asks you where the user files are. If they're roaming, it's not going to be able to locate them automatically, so I'll have to click this Add button and then browse out to my network location, or in this case to my directory on my desktop that I'm pretending is on the network. So I'll select I'm not going to select the individual users, I'll just select that directory, because that's what Dragon is looking for. I did the wrong directory, I'm sorry. Let me remove all those, because those are my version 10 ones. I have a directory that has some version 9 users in it. Let me go ahead and select that one. It's going to give me a list of all the users that are in that directory. If they're all good, then I'll upgrade all of them, but just for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to remove most of them and just leave a couple of them in there. Let me get rid of that one because it's big. So once you've selected the users to upgrade, you can go to multiple directories by clicking this Add button and continuing to add directories. But as you can see, if every individual user were in its own directory, for example, if you were using the home drive as the repository for roaming user files, then it would be pretty cumbersome if you had a lot of users. I'll click the Next button, and it's going to ask me where to put the upgraded user files. And in a roaming user situation with multiple files in one directory, or even if you have a local machine that's used by a number of different users, you're going to want to create a new directory to put the user files in. This is so you don't have a directory with both version 9 and version 10 user files in it, and that can be confusing to users if they pick the one that doesn't match the version of Dragon that they're running. So typically what you'll do is create a new directory, which I've already done. I'll just specify it here. I've got an empty directory for my upgraded version 10 users. And just to put this in perspective, the scenario here is you have not upgraded any of the end user PCs yet. Okay. The end users are still using version 9. This upgrade is still going to leave the version 9 user files intact. So each user is going to be continuing to use their version 9 user file until you get around to upgrading their workstation. And then at the point where you upgrade the workstation, you want to change the administrative settings on that workstation to point to the new directory with the version 10 users in it. Okay. So if you do all this right, then it should be pretty much transparent to the end user, except that the color of the icon is going to change from green to red. Now, a little while ago I mentioned that we found a bug in the upgrade procedure for Dragon Medical. As soon as we started shipping Dragon Medical, we started getting phone calls from users who complained that after upgrading their user files, they saw a significant decrease in accuracy, which is pretty horrible, especially when we always advertise Dragon as having increased accuracy every time we come out with a new version. We found that Dragon is not selecting the correct acoustic model by default for medical users. And the workaround for that is to hit this Advanced button. And this will list all of your users and tell you exactly which acoustic model it shows for each of them. So if I go to this first one and click Acoustic Model, note that there are a number of choices. And in version 10, there's a lot more choices than in version 9. So if you've been supporting version 9 but haven't seen version 10 yet, one of the great things is we put in all these accented models, including Spanish and some regional U.S. models. But we also have this Best Match 3 Medical one, which is the one that doctors should be using. So if the user was using Best Match 3 Medical in version 9, they should be using the corresponding one in version 10. And in a lot of cases, if you leave the default setting, that's when users complain of reduced accuracy. So for each user, you'll have to make this choice manually, which is unfortunate if you have a lot of users. And we are coming out with a fix for this bug. I just don't know when the Army's going to get it. But if you go to each user, and in most cases, you're going to choose Best Match 3 Medical. So just go through and change each of those acoustic models to Best Match 3 Medical, unless you know somebody has a distinct accent that is listed here. So for example, if it's someone who speaks Spanish as a first language and they have an audible accent, then they'll probably get better results by selecting the Spanish, or if you select the Spanish accent model for them. Even if they are a Spanish-speaking doctor, for someone with a heavy accent, usually the accent model wins out over the medical in terms of improving accuracy. Okay, so we do apologize for that bug and the fact that you have to make this manual setting for every user that you upgrade, but at least you've seen how to do that. So once you've gone through that list of users and switched them all to Best Match 3 Medical, then you click OK. Click Next, and then click Begin. I'm not going to let the whole thing run at this point because it'll take a good few minutes, but that shows you what your involvement is with this process. And then what you'll see after this process is complete is, I'll just stop mine for now, but if you let this process run to completion, then your folder with the upgraded users in it should contain a user file with the corresponding username for each user.
Are those parameters, like for that Best Match Medical, can those be pushed out like your SMS or parameters you script?
No, because they are really parameters of the user file and not of the Dragon software itself. Really, the best way to fix this is for you guys to get a hold of the build of Dragon that has the fix in it, which was just recently issued. I'm not sure whether we're sending that to the Army automatically. I will follow up and find out when that is getting to you. At that point, we should also provide information to tell you exactly which build of Dragon it is, so that you can look in the Dragon help and figure out whether you've got the version with the bug fixed or not.
I'm concerned if you got a large fielding.
I don't know why I'm getting that message, but okay, I'll look into it. Any other questions on the upgrade? What I'd like to do, since we've been going for an hour, and we could probably, a lot of us could use a 5-minute break, I will take a 5-minute break. We'll pick up where we left off. But first I'll ask if there are any other questions you've thought of in the last 5 minutes on what we've covered already: roaming users, upgrading user files, setting the backup location. What I want to do next is discuss the data distribution tool, which is a mechanism for automatically distributing custom words and custom commands that users might want to add to their user files in Dragon. The words get added to the user vocabulary. I'm not going to go into the end user aspects of these of these features, but these are things that the end user can customize. So users can add words to their vocabularies or phrases, and they can also add custom commands like the one I demonstrated before when I said a couple of words and it popped a big bunch of text into my note. The way you get these distributed to multiple users is by setting up something called a data distribution directory. And you can do this independently of whether you're using roaming users or not. It's not going to require nearly the kind of disk space on the network that roaming users will require. And it doesn't magically push these customizations into all of your user files. It relies on Dragon for each end user to look in that directory every time it opens a user file. And if it finds words and commands that you've added to that data distribution directory, then it will copy them into the user file that's in the process of being opened. The location of the data distribution directory is, again, something that you specify in the administrative settings. Okay. You want to put this on the network, most likely. And again, you can put it on the network even if the user files are local. This will all work. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but I'll talk through it and then we'll see if we've still got questions.
Hey, Val.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I meant to get this in before you started on the.
Okay.
This Calvin with the math team. I had a question. Did we ever fix the command browser when you create a shortcut and you ask it to save as a shortcut and it goes into the command browser instead of the content box?
That has been reported to engineering as a bug. It's a timing issue that they may be able to fix in the point release. We can't make any promises about what's going to get fixed when, but we do have a point release actively in development, and it seems to me that would be a pretty straightforward thing to fix in the point release. So stay tuned for details.
Okay, so the answer is that we just copy into the content. Don't request at this time until otherwise to try to make a shortcut.
Right, yeah. Instead of using the make, if somebody's having trouble with the make that a shortcut command, if it's putting the text in the wrong place, then yeah, just have them set the command up manually using copy and paste.
I'll do it, thank you.
Yeah. When we come out with a point release, we'll come out with a list of bugs that have been fixed so that you'll know whether it's been fixed or not. But once we come out with a point release, I don't know how long it will take the Army to test it and build a package with it. So they just hang in there with it the way it is for now. So to set up that data distribution directory, the first thing I have to do is create an empty directory on the network. And again, I'm pretending my desktop is the network, and I've created a data distribution folder there, just an empty folder. Where I specify that is in the miscellaneous settings in the administrative settings dialog. I'll go ahead and change the data distribution directory by browsing. Again, ordinarily this would be on the network, but I'm just going to choose this directory that's on my desktop. Yeah, in fact, it looks like I had made that setting already yesterday, and it's still in there. Okay. And this you would have to do on every machine, every PC. So if you've got Dragon already installed, you'll have to change the data distribution setting manually. If you're going to be installing it as part of a package, then you can add that setting to the package. And then as an administrator, your job would be to get files into that data distribution directory using the tool that we provided for that job. Oops, Dragon Medical 10, Dragon Medical Tools, Data Distribution Tool. So this tool lets you put basically 3 different kinds of things in that data distribution directory. Base vocabularies you're probably never going to have to worry about because the base vocabularies that are already in Dragon Medical support all the medical specialties that you're likely to encounter. So you're going to be doing either shared commands or shared words. Let me go ahead and do vocabulary words because it's a little easier to see them. in order to do this, you have to have your words in a file. And I have a couple of files here which are also available on our website and I think have been placed on the MAPS portal as well. One called MHS Terms. If we open it up and see, it's just a text file that has one word or phrase per line containing, as you can see, phrases that are useful in dictating the names of MTFs and the names of bases. And then we've also got all the proper names that appear in the names of military bases and NTFs. So it's a long list of terms that are specific to the military and some of your specialized terminology as well. As we learn additional words, we're adding them to this file. Okay. So it's just a text file with one word or phrase per line. And we've got a second one as well, which is an Army-centric list of ranks, so that when you say the rank, it should spell it and capitalize it correctly the way the Army does. So I'll tell Dragon that I'm going to add words to this directory. I'll click Next. The language is English. You've got no choice, because that's the only language we have installed. We need to tell it which files to import, so I'll click that Import button. Those files are on my desktop, so I'll browse to them. You can select multiple files. And when you've got the files all selected, click Next. And it's a very quick operation to put those files into that directory. I'll click Finish, and for some reason it takes me back to the first screen again, and I just have to cancel from here. What that tool has done is, if I open up that data distribution directory, I can see now it's got a folder underneath it called ENX, which corresponds to the English language. And under that, it has copies of the files that I provided as input. So really all this tool has done is copy the files into that directory, but I do like to use the tool instead of doing a manual file copy at least the first time I set one of these up. The reason being you want to make sure it creates the ENX subfolder within that directory. And then once that subfolder has been set up, it's perfectly okay and equivalent to copy word lists into this file. The same with commands, except that the way you create a file of custom commands is that after users have created the commands in Dragon, you can use a tool called the command browser, which end users are trained to use to create an exported file of commands. And again, you can add that file to this directory either using the tool, or once the tool has set up the correct subfolder, then you can copy the files in there manually. And now what happens, it's a little hard to demonstrate this since, well, let me go ahead and, well, if I open this one up, I might have to train it. I forget which of my user files are trained or not, but I'll just talk through the process. What happens at this point is, suppose this is our mythical Dr. Hansen. He's on his computer, which you have also gone into the administrative settings and pointed it to the same data distribution directory. So Dragon knows to look into that directory. In fact, let me go ahead and select a user that I know this will work with. In other words, I can open the user without having to train it because I know I've already trained this one. I'll go ahead and open that, and then, the reason it's complaining is that I have a Windows Explorer session that is pointing to that directory with the user files in it, so I have to close Windows Explorer before I can open that user. So let me do that again. I'll go to Pretend Roaming. I'll open my Pretend Roaming user. And then if you keep an eye on the Dragon toolbar up here where it says Loading User Files, toward the end of that process, you should see a message that says Updating User Files. There we go. And that's the point at which Dragon is looking in that directory to see if there are any word lists or command lists that have been placed there since the last time this user file was opened. Okay. So that's the point at which the user file actually takes on these customizations that we're trying to give it. So again, what this tool does not do is it does not push all of those words and commands right into the user file. It essentially allows Dragon to suck them into the user file, to pull them in at the time the user file is open. So think of this as a pull rather than a push, but you're kind of starting the process by putting those files in a central place where Dragon can find them.
By your experience, what would be your best estimate for amount of space you need for data distribution?
These word lists and command files are typically very small, no more than a few kilobytes. If we take a look at this file of terms, for example, which has about 450 words and phrases in it. Okay, it's less than 9 kilobytes. Your command file sizes are going to be similar, so you shouldn't need more than a megabyte or so in a typical installation. Like I said, it's really typically very small.
Your dealings with the Army, are they thinking about the two files you mentioned would be a perfect for standardizing, across?
Yeah, exactly.
And even the position, even where this is located, are they thinking of doing that in a package or something?
There's no way to include this in the package because the location of the data distribution directory is going to have to be a local decision. So even if we could standardize on the contents, the best we could do is, I hope that as the MAPS project evolves, that somebody will take ownership for there are people that take ownership for the files on the MAPS portal. So the files on the MAPS portal can kind of represent the standard versions of those files, but again, each site is going to have to decide where that data distribution directory should go. Other typical uses for this is that each doctors often dictate the names of other providers in their note. You might say my patient was examined by Dr. So-and-so. So local site responsibilities would include putting together a word list that contains provider names, the names of places, hospitals, clinics in the local geography, if someone was seen at a community hospital, for example, before they came into the Army hospital. So there are local word lists that will probably need to be created as well.
Sure.
And the MAPS project is also, over time, probably going to evolve a fairly standard set of commands, although those are going to highly vary by specialty. So it may make more sense to distribute those manually by, say, just placing them in a central directory and allowing users to manually import them. That works too.
From the standpoint of centrally supporting this, and I understand they're going to be a central help desk, seems like, I'm just an editorial, that the standardization piece would be up front, so that, at least from a help desk perspective, these guys would know where these things are and what issues may come up. Yeah? One question.
Yeah, I think certainly the help desk should become familiar with whatever is on the MAPS portal. I know a lot of these support process issues and standardization issues are still being discussed. It's going to be an evolving thing. Yeah, there was another point I was going to make, and I forget what it was, but let me go back to the slides while I'm thinking. Yeah, I think I just wanted to make sure we'd hit all the points that were on that slide. Yeah, so you set up the directory, use the tool. I remember the other thing I was going to demonstrate. Which is that the default location, let me just set these back to their default settings. Click the Restore Defaults button there. The default location for data distribution is on the C drive. You can see the path right there. It's under Documents and Settings, All Users, Application Data, Nuance, Naturally Speaking, 10, Custom. Okay. So that's the default data distribution location. It is on the local hard drive. I don't know whether any of the Army facilities have done this, but I've certainly run into commercial facilities where for some reason they couldn't find a logical place for the data distribution directory. So what they did instead was write a script to push those files into this location that you see here, the custom directory on the local hard drive. So that is another approach to distributing words and commands, is to have a local data distribution directory and then some kind of script to push the files into it. Oh, and the point I wanted to make is think about file permission that you put on this directory. You probably don't want to allow every user on your system to write to this directory because people will put all kinds of garbage in it, whether deliberately or accidentally. I've certainly seen this happen. So probably you want to have just a small group of people, maybe your IMD folks and your Alta trainers, to have permission to write files to this directory, and then just make sure all of your Dragon users can read from it. Okay, data distribution, administrative settings. Certainly we've looked at the major topics here, and the rest of them are relatively small, I guess except for the optimizer. We still need to come to that. Just going in the order in which we have things set up in the slides, we're kind of discussing installation issues, because once you've decided where to put that data distribution directory, you'll have to make sure it gets set on every machine that's running Dragon. Something else that we're recommending is a good idea is before you, especially with these tablet PCs where many of you are in the process of rolling out the tablet PCs to your end users, while the machine is still in IMD's hands, it's probably a good idea to install Dragon and then do an audio check before turning the machine over to the users. That way, if there are any hardware problems with the audio system, you'll know about them right away. The process that end users are familiar with is that every time you create a new user file in Dragon, one of the first things it does is it runs the audio check. Basically, you read to it for a few seconds while it sets the volume level, and then you read to it again for a few seconds while it calculates the signal-to-noise ratio of your sound system. But there is a quick way to run that utility without launching Dragon and without creating a user file. Another reason I would recommend doing it from this command line here is if you go through the process of creating a user file, often you'll create that user file for the purpose of testing Dragon and testing the audio and then leave it there, and then the end user will accidentally use it instead of creating a new one and training it to their own voice. So that's why I think it's a good idea just to run the audio utility standalone. You've got let me switch back to my screen so you can see what this looks like. But you've got the command line there. I've got it here on my machine. And so this kicks me directly into the audio setup without even launching Dragon. I happen to have Dragon running, but that wouldn't happen. In this step, the computer listens to the sound of your voice and adjusts the volume setting of your microphone. When the computer has finished adjusting the volume, it beeps to signal that the process is complete. If you reach the end of this text but have not heard a beep, start reading the text again from the beginning. If all you're doing is the audio check, it actually doesn't matter what you say. You don't have to read this text verbatim. You do want to notice that this blue bar is moving up and down, which means that it's dynamically setting the volume level until it settles on one that it likes for your voice, and it's going to be different for everybody. If you happen to have the Windows mixer open with the display set to the recording settings, you would actually see the mixer slider moving up and down in tandem with this blue slider here, because that Dragon is adjusting that same setting.
Have you set this up?
And actually, while we're looking at that first screen, I'll point out that if there's something grossly wrong with your sound system or your microphone, you're probably going to know about it here. If Windows gives you an error message saying it can't find the multimedia device, that means that either there's a hardware problem or a software setup problem in Windows. If it's acting like if it can find the sound system, but it's acting like it's not hearing any sound, if it gives you a message saying the volume level is too low, then it could be a faulty microphone. The headset mics that we ship do undergo a great deal of quality control, but like any other hardware, some small fraction of units are going to be bad out of the box, or somebody may be using an old microphone that has gone bad. So if it flunks this test, probably the easiest and first thing to do would be to swap microphones and see if the problem is in the microphone. If you go on to this second screen, this is going to ask you to read a little bit longer, and at the end of this screen is going to give you the signal-to-noise ratio, which is the ratio of sound to background noise. In fact, on this graph, you can see green, which is the level of the speech signal, versus yellow, which is the level of background noise. So that right there lets you kind of eyeball the sound system, and what you want is a lot of green and not very much yellow. The exact number doesn't matter too much. Doctors often take this as a personal measure of how well they speak, just because they're used to being rated on things. But really, it's just a pass-fail check of the quality of your sound system. Anything up from a 15 is a passing score. Since it's a ratio, the theoretical high score is infinite, but you're typically not going to see anything outside of the 30s. And if it flunks this screen, then the first thing you want to do is play back your speech.
and then when it comes to map, have them go over it again.
I don't know if you can hear that through your phone, but it is playing back my voice. It's a good idea to listen to this through the earphone rather than through the speakers, so you can get a precise listen at whatever noise might be in the signal. So if the sound system is bad enough, or if there's enough environmental noise to cause this screen to fail, then you're probably going to hear it when you play this back. Just as a recent example of a situation that we troubleshot by listening to this audio playback was with a particular Fujitsu tablet that one of the Madigan trainers brought to the MAPS training. It was flunking on this screen, and when we played back the audio, we could hear some kind of muffled sounds. In fact, if we retested this and actually pounded on the table while the user was speaking, and then played back the audio, we could hear the pounding. The implication was that it was picking up sound through the built-in microphone in the tablet in addition to the headset. So what we found was there were actually two different, the multimedia system, it presented itself as two different multimedia systems in Windows, and we had to select the right one in order to disable the built-in microphone. If there's a source of electrical noise, you'll hear that 60 hertz hum that you hear if your speakers are improperly grounded, for example. So there are all kinds of situations that could induce noise in the system. But at least by listening to this playback, you can tell whether it's a physical noise or an electrical noise that's causing a problem. So that's a little bit of basic audio troubleshooting there.
The audio settings that you're testing out right now, they all go back to the user file, don't they, or the profile?
When the user creates their own profile, they will be asked to run the audio settings as part of that process, and in that case, they get stored. But if you're running the audio setup standalone, that information doesn't get stored anywhere. It just gets.
What if you're running it in cache mode and you're not connected to the network? Does it get updated?
No, because again, if you're running the audio if you're running the audio.exe just by running it from the command line, this doesn't save any settings anywhere.
Okay.
It's just running the audio check, and then on that last screen, you'll know whether it passed or failed. So it's really purely as a troubleshooting measure. Now that first screen where it sets the volume, that's going to vary from user to user because some users are louder than others. So that's why even if you've already run the audio check and verified that the system is okay, when the end user goes to create their user file, whether it's local or roaming, it is going to redo this step because the sound level has to be set appropriately for that person. I hope that kind of answers the question.
Good. Yeah, just a quick question. I'll let you move on. You know, if I'm a roaming user and I'm running my user profile in cache mode. I haven't connected maybe a day or two or whatever down the line, and then I take my machine back and I connect back to the network. And what I missed was period of time was maybe something where you updated the file. So let's say like acoustic optimizer was run or something like that. What happens to the next time I log into the network? Does it pull the latest or what?
It will pull the latest, and if you have used Dragon in cache mode with a machine that's off the network, but then during that intervening time, if you've also used it from a machine that was connected to the network, it should merge together all of those changes. Okay. The ones that it has been making incrementally, as well as the ones that are coming in from your machine that was off the network. If the acoustic optimizer has been run, then what it's going to do is it's going to pull down the entire user file fresh, that whole 25 megabytes, and then apply to it any incremental changes that you've made while you were running it from the cache.
Thank you.
And I'll also mention that if you're using roaming users, the audio setup settings are stored on a per machine basis. Because again, that's designed to accommodate slight variations in the sound system as you, as you go from machine to machine. All right, so that's how to do a quick check of the audio system. The other thing that you might need to get involved in is if you are still installing the software manually, what you're going to want to do is manually set the default end user options. That we've made some recommendations in conjunction with, basically what we did is we sat down with our trainers. We have our own list of pet settings that we like to make, and we discussed them with Dr. Walker, who is kind of the key physician that's been providing input to the MAPS project. And we came up with a list of default options, which are shown on this slide here. I'm not going to get into what they all mean. I'll show you what they look like to the end user by switching back to my desktop here. I'll have to go ahead and load a user file so that we can see them. So end users can make these settings manually as well. We have gone over these settings with the trainers as part of the MAPS project, if they're training users on machines that were set up before the package was created. So basically, the end user can go into an options dialog and change all these things. I think I've already made the changes that we've recommended, so there's not much to change here. But any changes that I make here as an end user get saved only in my user file. They do not affect other users that might be using the system. So there's an options dialog with multiple tabs, and there's also a formatting dialog with multiple tabs that controls how the system does certain aspects of transcription. But in order to have consistent settings and to make it so that each end user doesn't have to go in and change those settings, so that in the worst case, if something happens to their user file and it can't be recovered and they're starting from scratch, they don't have to make those settings from scratch again. It's really nice for you as an administrator to be able to make those settings for the defaults for the entire system. And this, I believe, has been done as part of the package. Certainly, we provided this list of settings to the team that built the package. You might want to verify that if you're installing this through SMS, just by creating a user and making sure it has all the settings on that list. But what you can do, if Dragon has already been installed, you can set default values for those options by running the Dragon executable, natspeak.exe, and you'll put set default options on the command line. And actually, let me shut down Dragon just because it's not a good idea to have it running at the same time. And then I'll go to set default options. So this doesn't launch Dragon. It's not going to display the Dragon toolbar. It's just going to display the options dialog. And then any settings that I make while it's in this mode are going to become the defaults for the system. They're not going to change the options within any of the user files that have already been created, but they will take effect anytime a user creates a new file while they're logged into this system. So again, I've got the same exact screens, and I can run through and make the changes manually. You don't have to click Apply to each one. You can just click OK when you're done with all of them, and it will make those the default settings. The same with the couple of changes that we recommend making to the formatting options. Somewhere I've got a command line to change the formatting options. Yeah, so this one, set default formatting options on the command line. You've got these on the slides as well. We'll bring up the formatting dialog.
That's okay. As long as we keep our names out there until the very end, they know who it's in.
And then any settings that you make in here will become the defaults for all users who create user files from this point forward. Okay. Again, hopefully you won't have to do that manually, since you should be picking up these settings from the package, but it's a good idea to know how to do so. And as I said, there is a slide in there that has the command lines that I've just shown you how to run. Okay. I want to spend a few minutes discussing a tool that we've mentioned a couple of times. This is the Acoustic and Language Model Optimizer. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a tool that uses that up to 500 megabytes of data that gets accumulated per user. There's certainly no sense in accumulating that data unless we put it to good use for improving accuracy. And we recommend running it periodically, every week or so. I think you have the option to run it weekly or monthly. And at the outset, running it weekly might not be a bad idea as users build their accuracy and use Dragon more and more. If the user files are roaming, then an administrator needs to run this tool, again, to force Dragon to run it on the master copy instead of defaulting to the local one. So the model here is that it would be run not on an end user's PC, but on an administrator's PC. And you would set this up to run probably in the middle of the night so that it can run when users are not in the process of using Dragon. And I'll show you what it looks like to set that up. If your user files are local, then users can run the optimizer themselves through one of the Dragon menus called the Accuracy Center, and that's something that trainers can work with them on. Let me switch back to my desktop again, and we'll see what that looks like. So this is another of the Dragon-related tools that you find on your Start menu. So under Dragon Medical 10, Dragon Medical Tools, Acoustic and Language Model Optimizer Scheduler. That's a mouthful. That's probably the biggest thing that's on your Start menu. And when you run it, the first thing you're going to do is tell it which directory to look at. Actually, I've got a task set up from yesterday. Why don't I just get rid of it so we can start from scratch here. Okay. So this is what it'll look like when you're starting from scratch. It'll probably default to the directory from which you most recently entered user files. So you may or may not see something in here. The first thing you'll want to do is tell it which directory the user files are in. Yeah, it defaults to the last used directory. It lets you select from the same set of directories that appear on the Open User dialog. But if you haven't actually been running Dragon as a user on this machine, then you may not see anything in this list unless it's, well, I was going to say unless it's configured for roaming. But what you'll need to do is disable roaming actually before it will let you run this utility. So you've got a browse button here that will let you browse out to the network directory that has your roaming user files in it. So that's how it manually select that. So it updates the display to show the user files that are in that directory. And then what you'll do is click this New Task button. Since this is going to schedule a task through the Windows Task Scheduler, it needs to know what Windows user account to run under. So you'll have to specify your Windows, well, it'll default to your domain and username that you're currently logged in with. And you'll put your Windows password in here. And then it comes up with a window that asks you to specify the parameters for this task. If you're going to be optimizing multiple users in one run, then click the multiple users button, and it'll list all of the users that are in that selected directory. You can add them all. I'm just going to add a couple for the sake of demonstration here. So you've told it which users to optimize. You probably want to do both acoustic and language model optimization. The difference there is acoustic optimization is that will optimize its model of how your voice sounds, your pitch, your timbre, your accent, whereas language model optimization will optimize your vocabulary based on which words you use most frequently and which sets of words you tend to use together. So that's why there are two different things to optimize. We would generally recommend optimizing them both. You can set this task to run one time, although it's not a bad idea to set it up as a recurring task. Either, well, daily is probably overkill, but weekly is not a bad idea. Note that for each individual user that you've chosen to optimize in this task, the optimizer may or may not actually do anything. If there is no new data, or not very much new data gathered since the last time the optimizer was run on a particular user, then it simply won't do anything. If it doesn't have new data to work with, it doesn't need to do anything. You want to specify a start date. So if I want to run this task every Friday night, for example, I'll specify it to start running tomorrow. And I should pick, as I said, a time in the middle of the night when users are not going to be using Dragon. It's hard to predict, and we get asked frequently for some measure of how long this thing is going to take to run. Because what will happen with roaming users is if a user comes in the next morning and tries to use Dragon at a time when their file is still being optimized, I think they get a message saying that the optimizer is currently running and they'll have to try again later. Certainly you want to avoid that, so certainly it would be really great if we could tell you how long it's going to take to run. I'll say typically it shouldn't take more than about, half an hour per user is a lot of time. I've seen it take more time than that if it hasn't been run in a very long time. But if you're running it on a regular basis, weekly or even monthly, then I'd say probably half an hour per user, in my experience, is about an upper limit on what you can expect. So if you've got many, many users to optimize, what you'll probably want to do is do some of them on Monday night and some of them on Tuesday night, etc. If you have more users than can run in a batch overnight, then you'll have to set this up to run on multiple machines. So, your first 10 users will get optimized on one machine and the next 10 on another machine and so forth. Since this uses the task scheduler, this machine doesn't have to remain logged in. It just needs to remain turned on so that the task can start running overnight when its time comes up. Once I've made all these settings, I'll click OK. Note that there's an enable button so that I can leave this task in the system but disable it temporarily if I have any, if the recurring task, if there's any reason to do that. And then you could come back next week and take a look at the status and see the last result. It should tell you success, or if there was some kind of failure, it should tell you there. In this case, it's saying it hasn't run yet, so we're not going to wait until Friday to see whether it runs. I just wanted to give you an idea of what it looks like to run this utility. And again, this task would be pretty cumbersome if your roaming user files were all in separate directories, such as home drives, because you would have to set the user directory separately for every user file on the system and set up a separate task for it. Okay. So that's what that looks like. Any questions on the optimizer? And actually, let me answer a question that came in from one of the trainers just today, I think, which is, once the optimizer has been run on any particular user, is there a reason to retain that data, that set of data that can go up to 500 megabytes? The answer is yes, because this data also gets used during user file upgrades. When we come out with the hypothetical next version of Dragon, we'll probably call it version 11, generally what Dragon does during an upgrade is it essentially creates a user file from scratch and then trains it based on any existing data it has for that user. So if you retain the optimizer data, then the upgrade process will use that data to train the new user file for the next version, and that user will benefit from the best possible accuracy after the upgrade. So we do recommend retaining the optimizer data.
May I ask maybe a stupid question? You just mentioned the fact that it's got to be retained during upgrades. So during an upgrade per user, is there an overhead as far as time needed to upgrade every user if it's gonna do that?
The upgrade can be time-consuming, and unfortunately, that's another area where we're getting a lot of requests from customers for some way to predict how long it's going to take. That's difficult to do. The major factor in upgrading, in particular with a roaming user or any user that's stored on the network, is the amount of time it takes that data, all of that training data, to come down to the workstation where you're running the upgrades and then to get saved back up to the network. And we've done some experimentation and found that you can't even predict by doing a simple file copy, because essentially we're accessing the files randomly, and there are a lot of factors that determine how long it takes to get to the data. So unfortunately, that's a complicated way of saying no, we can't answer that question. Probably what you want to do is, one thing, if this may be a little off base for some of you, but if your file server is running Windows, then you could install Dragon right on the file server and run the upgrade right on the file server. That would be the quickest way to do it. But that file server may be off limits to software installation. It may not even be running Windows. It might be a Unix file server. So that's not always going to be an option. The next best thing would be to have to run the upgrades from a workstation that is located as physically close to the server as possible on the network, certainly in the same building. because we have heard from customers that upgrades can take a very long time if, for example, the administrators are sitting in a different building than the file servers are. So that's a good question. That's an important factor, and I'm sorry we don't have a really great answer. Okay. Any other questions on the optimizer or on upgrades? Okay. The last couple of little tiny topics. One is how to export and import user files. As I mentioned earlier, this is essentially an end-user task in most cases, although where they're probably going to need your involvement is just in getting the files onto a removable device, since at least my understanding is that users in the Army are not supposed to put CDs or DVDs into their own machines anymore. So, and certainly thumb drives have been off limits for a long time. So if you want to be able to give the provider a copy of their user file, and remember that can range in size from 25 megabytes up to 500, so it's not something that you can just email to yourself at the next location. It really does need to go on a physical device such as a CD-ROM. So I certainly can't answer the policy questions as to how it gets there, but the mechanics of how you would export those files in Dragon are something we'll take a look at. So if somebody has a roaming user file and they're going to want to take it to a different MTF or a different location, or if they're leaving the Army to go into private practice and you're kind enough to let them take their user file with them, what you can do is just with a roaming user file, a simple file copy will do. You know where those files are. You can recognize them by username. So just copy the directory that has that user's name along with all the subdirectories that are in it. Okay. And then copy it. And then on the other end, the IMD staff on the other end would then take that same set of files and copy them up to their roaming user directory. So to add users to Dragon, there's nothing special you have to do except just copy the files in there. If they contain a valid Dragon user file, then it will show up on the Open User menu the next time anybody launches Dragon and looks at that list of users.
This is Terrell again. I have one question.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way, I must have missed this part, is each user account password protected?
It's not password protected as such. You can, and although this is a point that I don't think I made before, you can control access to those user files through Windows file permissions. Generally what you'll do if you're putting the user files in a shared network directory is you have to set the permission, so like here's my pretend roaming user directory. If I go into the properties, I do need to make sure that all users have at least read, write, and modify access, or it's simpler to give full control access to that top level directory. But what you want to do is make it so that that permission does not propagate to subdirectories. So whenever a user creates a user file, they become the owner of that file, and then other users are prevented from opening it. So I think I might have mentioned that earlier, is that you'll be able to see all of the users on the system, but if you've got the file permissions set properly, then if I try to open someone else's user file, I'm going to get a message from Windows saying I don't have permission to access the file. So there's no password protection on the files as such. But since you, being part of DoD, require every user to log in with their own identity under Windows, then you can take advantage of Windows file permission to prevent users from opening each other's files. If you've got local user files, then in order to export the user file, since, as we saw, the user files on the local hard drive are stored in a directory tree that it's a little complicated to navigate. Certainly the end user isn't going to know where they are. You're going to know where those files are by the time you've been working with Dragon for a while. But it's actually simpler to go into the Dragon user interface and go into this Manage Users window. This is different from Open Users. It's on the menu right under Open Users. But here it doesn't show the different microphone types and the different vocabularies. It's just got one entry for each user. So you select the user that you want to export, click Advanced, Export, and then browse to the location where you want to save that user file. Maybe that's a network directory temporarily, and then somehow you can get it onto a removable device such as a CD-ROM. And then what the user does at the other end when they get assigned to their new MTF and get their new machine running Dragon, they would launch Dragon. If it's a new installation of Dragon, well, it might go, if they're using local user files and there aren't any, it's going to bring up this window that asks them to create a new user. But what they will have to be trained to do is to cancel out of this directory, cancel out of Open User if it comes up, go into Manage Users. So again, they're not going to see anything here if it's a brand new installation. They'll click Advanced Import and then import that file from the CD or wherever they put it. So, like I said, not strictly an administrative task, but something you might get called on to help with.
You could have my job. Maybe I should become a contractor.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's in here. Because I want that in reading state biology.
Yeah, see, I had that reading study in really time. But I was in July. But you know something, Nancy, honestly,
so there's a few hints there. And then just one last little thing I wanted to look at. We've already taken a look at the file location, so I think we've pretty well covered that. But as I mentioned earlier, if you report an issue to Nuance Technical Support, in most cases they're going to ask you for a copy of a file called dragon.log. This is the error log file that Dragon creates to keep track of, well, exactly that kind of information that our engineers can use to troubleshoot unusual problems. The location of that file is shown here on the slide. We'll take a little peek into one of those files so you can see what it looks like. There are a couple of things in there that might be useful. If you're logged in as the end user that's been using Dragon, then you can find that file very easily from the Start menu. You go to Dragon Medical 10, Show Dragon Log, and this will open the folder that contains that log file. Take a note of the path, which was also shown on the slide, because if you are logged into the PC as an administrator, then you're manually going to have to browse to this location and make sure you put the end user's Windows username at this point in the tree. So however you get to this log file, there it is. If you're reporting a problem with a user upgrade, you might have to send this upgrade log as well. And if it's a setup issue, which you probably won't have with a push installation, but you might have with a manual installation, there's a setup log in a different location that you might be asked for as well. Okay. Most of what's in the error log is not really intelligible to the ordinary human being, but there are a few things that it's nice to look at. Whenever Dragon starts, it checks on a few things. It checks on the system configuration to make sure you've got enough resources to run it. It checks to see what kind of audio system you're using. So, for example, I had the PowerMic 2 plugged in, so it showed me that as my audio system. A little farther down, there's a few lines that begin with MREC, which is the internal acronym for the recognition engine, the thing that converts speech to text. And this is going to tell you exactly what build of the operating system it's running. Actually, we should look at exactly what build of Dragon it's running. When we look at a log file, we can tell what build of Dragon was running because that shows up right near the top here. Dragon version medical 10.006000537. I think this is the same one that you guys are running. If you go a little farther down, it tells you exactly which version and build of Windows it's running. The machine speed, it actually calculates. It doesn't trust the machine speed that the CPU reports to it. It runs a little benchmark test that computes the actual clock speed of the machine, which may be different than what you think it is. So this looks like it's almost 2 megahertz here, or 2 gigahertz. Same thing with RAM. The amount of physical RAM on the system may be different from the amount of RAM that Windows is actually using, so it's the latter. The RAM that Windows is using will show up here for the RAM. I'll show you how many CPUs there are, the name of the machine, and some other housekeeping stuff like that. So that's nice to know. Something else that's nice to know, again, if you're in a situation where you're trying to figure out exactly where it's opening the user file from, if you search for the word roaming,
10 gigabytes. Your machine.
Yeah, you'll see a message like this, current user is roaming. So this will tell you whether Dragon is opening that user file as a roaming user or as a local one. I'm not sure you can all see the bottom of the screen, so let me move that up. But yeah, it's this line that says current user is roaming. 0 means it's treating it as local, and 1 means it's treating it as roaming. It's also telling you exactly the path to the user file that is opening, so that can be useful as well. If it's a roaming user, it's actually going to show you the local path, in other words, the path to the locally cached copy, but you can certainly tell a local user file from a roaming one. Let's see, no, that's not the path to the cache. It's, oh, that's because it's not a roaming user file. I'm going to try to find. Okay, I've opened so many users that I don't remember what's in this log. But again, once you get used to looking at these, you can pretty easily tell whether Dragon is running with local or roaming users. And then finally, if there are any error messages, as any of you who work with end users know, most users will give you very vague statements if there's a problem. They'll say it doesn't work, or they'll say, well, it gave me a message that said something about an error. What you want, and certainly what Nuance wants if you report a problem to us, is the exact text of any error that they get. So as with any other software, getting a screenshot of any error messages is a really good idea. But if they didn't catch a screenshot, the next best thing is that if Dragon reports an error, it will generally put the same error message in the log file as well. Okay. So you can look for that yourself if you want a little clue as to what might be going on. Sometimes those messages are useful to you. Sometimes they're useful only to us. But anything that Dragon reports will be in this log file. But you know, it's not necessarily your job to understand this file, just to be able to find it so that if you report problems to us, you can send us that file with it. I mentioned there's also a setup log, which is similarly easy to find. If you go to the Start menu, Dragon Medical, show setup log. You'll generally be doing this when you're logged in as the administrator that set up the software, so that should actually get you to the setup log, which is generally going to be in your directory under local settings. Okay. Any questions on that or on anything at this point? Because we're about out of time. I'm out of slides. Any questions on anything in the world related to Dragon?
Yeah, well, maybe another silly question, but the administrative login, is that a separate login for DNS, or is that integrated with maybe an AD login?
That will be an AD login that gives you administrator permission on the PC.
Okay.
Yeah, so you do have to be, if you're doing a manual install of Dragon, you do have to be logged into the PC as an administrator, and to get into the administrative settings of Dragon, you also have to be logged into the PC as an administrator.
Okay, got you.
Yeah, no, good question. Thank you. Anything else? Okay.